church planter can walk 20 miles in a day. Give him a bicycle and he can go 3 times as far and be 3 times as effective. It's so good to be together once again as we continue our chronological study through the entire New Testament. Thanks for joining me. We're in Matthew chapter 27 today. We've just finished the story of Peter's denial of Jesus, fulfilling what Jesus said he would do, and Peter having great regrets about that and weeping bitterly. And today we're going to begin looking at another person who had great regrets, but it didn't turn out so well for that person in the end, namely Judas. But before we read about Judas, let's start in Matthew chapter 27 and verse number 1 and set the stage for where we're at in this story of the final day of Jesus's life on this earth, before he was resurrected. Now when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus to put him to death. They wanted him dead. They had deemed that he was worthy of death because of his blasphemy. They were envious of his popularity. These were bad guys who were wearing the good clothes. And wow, if there ever was a case of the guilty condemning the innocent, this was it. They found a sinless person, God himself, guilty and worthy of death. Now, the problem was they just couldn't take him out and stone him. That's what the law of Moses prescribed. But because they were a nation under Roman authority and domination, they had been restricted in administrating capital punishment. They had to, go to the Roman authorities. And so that forced them to have to take Jesus to Pilate and try to persuade him that this man, Jesus, was also worthy of death. And so we read in verse number 2, they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate, the governor. Sometime early in the morning, again, not knowing exactly what time Jesus was arrested in the garden. We don't know how long his trial took, his mock trial took, but it's thought that probably he was incarcerated there for a number of hours that night in Caiaphas' house. Now, Matthew takes a break in the story here and then turns to focus on Judas, something that is unique in his gospel. You don't find it in Mark, Luke, or John's gospel. And it's an interesting study, okay? So let's start in Matthew 27 and verse number 3. Then when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned, he felt remorse, and he returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. And there's a key word there, I think, that we need to hone in on just for a moment. That is that Judas felt remorse. And there's a reason for it. It says, when he saw that Jesus was condemned. Could be interpreted different ways. Some interpret it, well, he really didn't think Jesus would be condemned. And he really thought when he was betraying Jesus that Jesus would use his supernatural power and deliver himself, and therefore he wouldn't have Jesus' blood, on him. However, it could also be interpreted that, he just wasn't thinking of the outcome and hadn't thought through the ramifications of his act of betrayal, and that, this would really be the outcome, which we all know what the outcome was. And so now it just hits them. Oh my goodness, what I've done has resulted in Jesus being condemned. So he feels a remorse about this. He's regretting it. But what we don't see in Judas is an act of repentance. You say, well, wait a second. He returned the 30 pieces of silver. Granted, he did. He was trying to do something to absolve himself of this huge burden of guilt that he must have felt for betraying not just the Son of God, not just Jesus Christ. It's hard to even believe that Judas believed those things about Jesus, but betrayed a very close friend, someone who had served him and loved him and just called him friend, moments before. That's got to create a huge burden of guilt on Judas. So trying to absolve himself of that guilt, he returns the 30 pieces of silver. But then the story goes on. Let's see. he returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, but they rejected the return of the money. Verse number 4, saying, this is Judas, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. And so they could care less about him. They had used him for their objective, and they had no more need of him. And so in verse number 5, it says, he threw the pieces of silver into the temple sanctuary and departed, and he went away and hanged himself. Now, that shows something of an attempt to escape from his current circumstances. You throw the money away. Okay, so I haven't been paid for this dastardly deed I've done. I don't have that stain on me. And now to escape the load of guilt, he hangs himself, which hard to understand what was going through his mind there. I've always wondered about anybody who commits suicide. Do they really think that's the end? Because death is not the end for anyone. It's the beginning of a new life in the spiritual realm, and they're going to have to stand judgment before God. And so it would seem to me that had Judas repented of his sin, and I assume that was within the realm of possibilities, something that could have been the scenario that was played out. Had he repented, he wouldn't have hung himself. That was an act of unbelief. I think he would have, confessed his sin publicly, gone to the apostles, asked for their forgiveness, and then done something to turn his life around to prove the sincerity of repentance and become, an obedient follower of Christ rather than the betrayer of Christ. So we don't see repentance, although we do see remorse. So that shows us, just because people are sorry for their sin, that's not the evidence of salvation. There has to be repentance for their sin. That is, a turning away from their sin and a setting on a brand new course. Now, we read something in the book of Acts that seems to contradict what we just read about Judas hanging himself, and a lot of scholars have wrestled over that for a while. We're going to tackle it next time. So I'll see you next time.
HeavenWord 7 is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.